The world's wealthiest economies gather for the G20 Summit in Rome. But with even friendly nations at odds, can they help solve the planet's biggest problems? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is the G20 Summit. Well, they're responsible for at least 80% of the world's GDP and 75% of its carbon emissions. So together, they should have the power to get things done. But with so many increasingly visible fractures, even among allies, it's not clear what the leaders of the 20 largest economies will be able to accomplish in Rome. With COP26 kicking off on Sunday as well, climate change will be high on the G20 agenda. Another damning UN report has illustrated just how perilous the situation is, warning the world is doing nowhere near enough to avoid catastrophe. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has, no surprise, called on G20 nations to do more.
So, as the title of this year's report puts it, the heat is on. And as the contents of the report show, the leadership we need is off. And far off. We know that humanity's future depends on keeping global temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius by 2030. And we also know that so far, parties to the Paris Agreement are utterly failing to keep this target within reach.
But how hard will global cooperation be, especially if several normally strong relationships are so strained? We've come to expect China and Russia to oppose the US and the EU, but at this year's summit, even traditional allies are at odds. France has shared strong ties with the UK, US, and Australia for decades. But when the three formed the AUKUS alliance to combat China's influence, it wasn't just Beijing who got angry. France, too, was furious. One, for being excluded, and two, for seeing its multi-billion-dollar defense deal with Canberra scrapped.
C'est vraiment en bon français.
It's really a stab in the back. We built a relationship of trust with Australia, and this trust was betrayed, and I'm angry today with a lot of bitterness about this breach of contract. This is not done between allies, especially when there's been 2 years of negotiations for this contract.
And now a row over post-Brexit fishing rights has seen relations between Paris and London reach new lows. France says the UK has only issued half the licenses French fishermen are entitled to access British waters. Without those documents, many could lose their livelihoods. But London claims it has approved almost all EU vessels that applied for access. On Thursday, tensions escalated as France seized a British trawler, saying it didn't have the right to fish where it was. A French minister says the British government only understands force. And the UK hit back, warning it is not afraid to retaliate.
So as I've said repeatedly, to the French, to the European Commission, our door remains ever open. And in that context, Madam Deputy Speaker, it is very disappointing to see the comments that came from France yesterday. We believe these are disappointing and disproportionate and not what we'd expect from a close ally and partner. The measures being threatened do not appear to be compatible with the Trade and Cooperation Agreement or wider international law, and if carried through, will be met with an appropriate and calibrated response.
Now, while a row like this between the UK and France is rare, animosity between China and the West is not. Tensions over Taiwan have been simmering for some time, and with Taiwan's foreign minister touring numerous EU states this past week, Beijing has watched on in frustration. And if it wasn't already strained enough, this week the U.S. clarified that it would defend Taiwan should China invade.
The United States has a commitment to help Taiwan provide for its self-defense. And that's part of the Taiwan Relations Act. It's a commitment we take very seriously. Our commitment to Taiwan is rock solid and contributes to the maintenance of peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait and within the region.
So how might all this friction feed into the G20 leaders meeting? To discuss that now, I am joined from London by Denis MacShane. He's the UK's former EU minister. Stephen Erlanger is in Brussels. He's the New York Times chief diplomatic correspondent in Europe. And from Beijing, we have China affairs analyst Einar Tangen. Thanks all so much for being with us. I'm going to start with this. I'll start in the middle there with Stephen. What are your feelings going into this summit? Which interactions between whom will you be observing kind of most closely to see where either, strengthened ties or increased friction actually takes things?
Well, there is a lot of friction in the world. I mean, the fact that Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping have both decided to skip it is, frankly, an indication of the level of friction. They just don't want to deal with it. Biden will obviously, he's did an apology tour, all his people did to France. So he and Macron will, try to patch things up, and Macron's running for election. So we'll see how Macron plays it. I hope he doesn't try to embarrass Biden. That wouldn't work very well with Biden. I'm very curious to see how Biden and Erdogan get on, given the latest spat over the 10 ambassadors who actually weren't kicked out. But Turkey has done itself some damage in the US, so that'll be interesting. And Turkey wants to buy F-16s to replace the F-35s that America won't sell them because of the S-400s, right? And then, of course, we're always interested in Biden, Boris Johnson, because Biden cares a lot about Northern Ireland and the Northern Ireland Protocol. And there is a deep suspicion, certainly in Brussels, that Lord Frost and Boris want to get rid of it. And so I think these are some of the real tensions, but I'm also very curious to see how Biden works with the Japanese, South Koreans, because obviously for the Americans, they have China on the brain.
A lot to watch. But Stephen, just quickly, I want to pick up on one of the first things you alluded to, and that is what you see as a snub then by China and Russia. They say they're not attending because of COVID concerns. You're pretty sure that is not the case?
Well, I mean, Putin kept himself locked up for months to try to avoid COVID. It's still not clear whether he actually got vaccinated with Sputnik 5 or with something else. But I think it's a bit of an excuse. And Xi Jinping, too, I mean, one wonders what vaccine he took. But I think for domestic reasons, they cannot control.
I mean, you're speculating on vaccine as a basis for your analysis. Come on. I mean, Xi hasn't come out of China since the beginning of the pandemic. And you're saying that he should come out for this. He is going to be giving his telecast. Putin, yes, I can't speculate on what he's thinking, but you didn't mention Japan for some reason. That is not meritorious of notice. Kishida is not
actually
coming. Also,
he
has an election. Wow.
I did mention Japan, but
yes, but you put it in some sort of arcane. This is all a big snub by the big powers. I mean, this is tabloid.
Why don't you say your piece?
It's interesting that there. You know what? Before the two of you get too into this, the details of this angle of it, it does illustrate a very interesting point that some do see this as a bit of a snub that they could have actually attended, but others are quite clear that this really is about COVID concerns because it's not just the Chinese and the Russians. So yeah, there'll be something, people will be drawing different conclusions from this. But let me get quickly to Denis, and let me just ask you if you're going to be watching more or less the same issues that Stephen is keeping an eye on, or are there some others that you're more interested in?
Yes, obviously I agree with Stephen that the Biden-Macron meeting is very significant. Biden's been backtracking, apologising, sending Tony Blinken, sending Jake Sullivan to Paris to say, hey guys, sorry, we goofed a bit. We didn't get quite right the sending the submarines to Australia. So I think that probably will seal that off with a nice hug. Well, it's a hug. They're French. They'll perhaps I'll have a kiss. Then I agree very much. I'm interested to see what Yoshihide Suga, the new Japanese Prime Minister, says or does, or whether, as very often with Japan, he just stays quietly and doesn't really raise a profile. But it's his first big outing. And then the next outing, of course, is Angela Merkel, who's taking by the hand Olaf Scholz, her likely pretty guaranteed successor as Chancellor of Germany, Social Democratic Chancellor of Germany, as Europe moves really away from the centre-right to a more centre-left position. And she is taking him around saying, hey, this is my successor, this is my man, different party, but German policy will continue, and please be very friendly with him. And then finally, the Macron-Johnson meeting over scallops and whatever fish you pick out from the channel. I mean, there's an extraordinary thing happening today. The French ambassador, one of the most experienced diplomats, ex-ministers in France, is being called in by the British Foreign Office. Being called in is, diplomatic parlance for washing your head, smacking your bottom, over a ridiculous, really, like something out of Gulliver's Travels between the Lilliputians and the others, quarrel over how many fishing boats should fish for a few scallops and mussels off the coasts of the Channel Islands. So Macron, Johnson, I'd like to be a fly on the wall at that meeting.
You know, Denis, two G20 members, two leading European powers at odds, and France and the UK actually in many ways just equates to the UK and the EU. So, how uncomfortable is it to have them engaged in this battle right now?
Well, look, this Brexit that Britain's engaged on, it's very similar, you won't remember, none of us were born, to America turning isolationist after 1920, pulling out of international organisations, turning its back, with American politicians saying, we don't want to know about Europeans. We hate the idea of a racial clause that would protect Japanese citizens in Britain, in America, because we don't like them. And it took about 10 years for that to work its way through the system. We're just at the beginning of this now, with the Prime Minister has to keep reassuring his own Brexit supporters with public opinion polls and economic opinion, all saying, look, Brexit is not going well. It was probably a mistake. He's got to keep saying, no, boys, no, stick together. It's going to be wonderful. And so, I'm sorry, for about 1,000 years, bashing the French has never lost a British Prime Minister any votes, and bashing the English has never cost a French president any votes.
Okay. Let me get to Einar. I want to ask you this. Do you think this summit, is it different this time? With this level of geopolitical tension and the strain, of 2 years of the pandemic taking its toll on everyone's economy and most everyone's political standing at this meeting?
Well, just recall why the G20 is around. It's supposed to be setting a course for the economic future of the world. And what you have here is, obviously we spent the first part of this discussing the kind of relations between leaders. I think it's important how they get along, but it's not something that I would spend much time on. There's still something called COVID-19 around, and we have global warming that's coming up in COP26. They added this issue about having the supply chain issues as everyone starts worrying about Christmas and things like this. There are serious issues, and also debt relief for these impoverished countries out there. What's missing here is a comprehensive economic plan. I don't understand why we're spending time on these minutiae, when in fact the world is going forward without a rudder.
It's interesting.
I don't think it's quite minutiae exactly. I completely agree. COVID's overwhelmed us. There wasn't a G20 around during the time of the Spanish flu, but I bet the Spanish flu in 1919-20 would have wiped out next stage economic thinking after the First World War. And the big thing that we haven't done, the G20 hasn't done, is help poorer middle-income countries, Africa, Asia, Latin America. And that, I think, should be a challenge. And also, this is a two-part G20 because it segues straight away to Glasgow, and then they can start discussing all the things they couldn't agree on in Rome tomorrow. They can start discussing all the things they may not agree on in Scotland next week.
Right. It's interesting. Go ahead, Stephen.
Yeah, no, I would simply say that, as always, the G20 looks for headlines that it can say, oh, see, we all agree on something. And I suspect that will be new promises about vaccines going to Africa and third world countries. And they'll make a lot of agreeing on a sort of corporate tax level worldwide, which is, I think, actually quite important. Even Ireland went along. 15% isn't perfect, but it does make a great deal of difference. So I expect those two things will be presented as everyone getting on and doing well to try to cover over some of this obvious friction that exists inevitably.
But Stephen, let me pick up on what many believe is kind of overwhelming the agenda of course, COP26, which is the reason for that summit, but it's going to overwhelm the G20 as well, because part of the reason these economies, are so strong is because they've been able to build massive industries that pollute more than most other countries on the planet combined. So with the climate crisis, expected to dominate this agenda, and everyone interested in protecting their economic future, where will we see cooperation there?
Well, that's a very good question. I mean, there's a lot of sanctimony involved, as you know, and there's a lot of promises being pushed off to 2050 or 2060. The European Union, which is not the world's biggest emitter, though it does pretty well, has committed itself by law to a pretty significant reduction by 2035. But inevitably, the questions of justice and fairness arise, particularly from countries like India and China, who are still industrializing, who still use an awful lot of coal, and who can't make the transition as quickly as others might. Well, obviously, China's working at it and India's working at it. But together, I think, if I'm not wrong, they make up about 38% of the world's carbon emissions. So there'll be a lot of pressure on them, but they have a good point to make too, which is that they got started later, and it is unfair for post-industrial societies of the West to use China and India as factories producing carbon for goods made for the West.
Right. Denis, I saw you had a comment. Go ahead.
Yes, China, to be fair, has said that it will stop CO2 production in due course inside China. But of course, its Belt and Road Initiative is massively exporting giant factories, all based on fossil fuel, coal principally, gas, energy sources. The second big question is, here in Europe, I'd say, there's real political concern about the price at the pump. Now, in the 1970s, some of us will remember that was toppling governments, the oil shock, the inflation, and a huge decade-long crisis. And I think there'll be a lot of attention paid, which is interesting why President Putin isn't turning up, on what could be done at a supranational level to control and manage gas energy supplies, because if this continues to sort of go up and up and up, we're talking about 250% increases on household bills in Britain, then there's going to be a great deal of political tension coming out of that.
Right. Einar, I mean, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, I mean, yes, I'm very concerned about the price of gasoline in the UK, and I'm sure the rest of the world is also. But, this issue that somehow China's at fault for helping other nations, what is Great Britain doing for these other countries along the Belt and Road? This idea that China's exporting coal factories seems a little bit much, since they just said they weren't going to do that or finance them. So, I mean, this kind of ongoing narrative that somehow it always comes back to China and China is at fault. What is the course that's going on? You leave these countries in the stands, impoverished and, with no ability to do anything because they don't have the infrastructure that you have. I find it, absurd that, somebody from Britain who's involved in all of this stuff is saying, oh, yes, just forget about it. Don't do anything.
No, I agree with you entirely. We all agree with you. That's not the argument. I mean, in Europe, there's a fascinating debate between President Macron, who's announced, if re-elected, he'll build 40 new mini-nuclear reactors, and the experts say these are quite safe, whereas the Germans on the other side, and Mr. Scholz will be following Mrs. Merkel, want to greenwash themselves and do away with all nuclear power, even though it doesn't emit any CO2, and turn to Mother Wind. So there are windmills all over Germany, except I'll give you a little secret about Germany. There's no wind in Germany. It's far away from coasts and seas and oceans. And so wind power in Germany requires little electric motors sometimes to make the windmills go round. That's a Europe
Not all
debate.
that much sun either, Dennis, in Germany. Not all that much sun.
Good old northern latitudes. Sorry. Go ahead, Dennis. Finish your statement.
I'm sorry. Well, no. I think we all accept it is patronising to the extreme to say somehow that China, that's made the most extraordinary progress in the last 30 years, now you all have to put it on hold because we're going to start making T-shirts in Pennsylvania and in Yorkshire. I mean, that is utterly ridiculous. I'm just saying that the politics now is changing the face of Europe, where green politicians are being elected not to run countries, but being coalitions that run countries. And believe me, green now is going to be a very big colour in European politics for a number of years to come. And the European Parliament, for example, won't, I think, sign off on any trade deal or investment deal with China or with the rest of the Pacific if simply those countries, and it also includes Korea and Japan, say, we're not going to do anything. It's all your fault. It's all historical legacy. We have to catch up with you for the next 100 years.
I'll tell you what, we are down to our last 4 minutes, so there's something important I want to get to because this is definitely looming over the G20 right now. We've been hearing a lot of mention of a new Cold War over the last year or so, and I want to understand, Stephen, I'll start with you, how you think that might be manifesting at the G20 now, especially, between China, Europe, and the U.S. over Taiwan, and given Russia's interests here as well.
Well, I never liked the analogy to the Cold War. Okay. I mean, China is not really an enemy. I mean, America likes to find enemies, but China really, we have enormously close economic relationships with China. We struggle over trade, we struggle over lots of issues, but we are not adversaries. Rivals, perhaps, fine, that's different. And I think the Taiwan thing is a bit overblown. I don't think China is ready to take Taiwan. I don't think it wants to risk taking Taiwan. And I think it's being politicized right now.
Okay, Einar, is it overblown?
No, it isn't. I mean, Taiwan is a red line for China. It is not a political play card. Sailing your gunships up and down the straits every month is not a sign of a rival. It is a sign of, intent. Selling arms, having trainers within Taiwan. These are all things that are kind of, exacerbating the situation with mainland China.
Do you think
so?
The United
this
States
idea that you should
prepare Taiwan to invade China? Is that what you're suggesting?
No, I don't think that's the case. But you and I know both very well that it would be a massive coup. PR coup if they could goad China into doing something, even like snatching a few small islands. This would be exactly what the U.S. would want in terms of going out and saying that, yes, see, China's the bad, empty actor that we've always said that our disinformation campaigns promote. So this idea that tut-tut, there's nothing going on here. I mean, you have AUKUS, you have the Quad, you have what's going on in Taiwan. You have the U.S. with 400 bases surrounding China. You tell me how this doesn't resonate with gunboat diplomacy and a colonialism 2.0.
No.
Well, I'm not sitting in Beijing, so it's a very hard question for me to answer. It does seem to me little Taiwan is not the aggressor here, and that the United States has military interests in defending Taiwan, in deterring China, and in keeping America's allies.
What interests in South U.S.
Let me finish.
Well, there's one big interest. There's one very big interest, if I may. One very big interest. We're all journalists in this conversation, and what China's doing in Hong Kong to destroy one of the finest centres of free journalism Asia's seen since the war is distressing. In all my life, and I first stood for Parliament, God, more than 4 decades ago, each generation needs its political, sort of human rights, freedom cause, apartheid, ending communism in East Europe, whatever it is, getting rid of the generals in South America. And unfortunately, I share much of the analysis on China that's been made from Beijing, but unfortunately, China does seem to want to provoke everybody with its treatment of Uyghurs, with its destruction of the remnant. Let me finish.
Let me finish. You had a year-long of riots in the street. Where was your vaunted, people decrying this? It was all about freedom fighters. When everybody was attacked,
it is nothing to do. Look, you're arguing. Look, please.
Okay.
Gentlemen, you're defending China. I'm just saying the politics in the rest of the world. And if you spit in the face of the people who are worried about Hong Kong, worried about treatment of minorities, worried about absence of freedom in China, you just try and whitewash it away. Good luck.
Okay, Denis, I'm going to have to finish with you there. And it will be very interesting to see if what manifests at the G20 is anything like what we just saw between the three of you here on China's issues with the US and Taiwan and Europe. But unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. We're completely out of time. I'd like to thank all three of my panelists really so much for being with us. And our viewers, of course, as well. Remember, you can follow us on Twitter at @the_newsmakers. And be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.